Figuring out where the hum is coming from is always the hardest part. Once you figure it out, life is good. I know, I'm just waiting. Because they're cleaning. And I'm thankful. Wow, look at that troll dog. Wow. Bigger than she is. That's awesomeness. Oh, cool. I think she said she got it was a girl trip. But is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a girl trip. It's awesome. Will you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, as we come before you, having read your word, having lived our lives, having sung your praises, and having offered ourselves before you, help us, O God. Protect us and guide us, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together might be acceptable in your sight. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The members of the worship committee can attest to the fact that I plan the scripture and title long before the week ahead. Little confession, those of you who know, this was Cake Week at our house. And Cake Week, which was Pie Week this week, but that's another story. Usually, now I'm confessing, usually I pull something out of the archives, or in preacher talk, I preach from the barrel. Because I know what the week is going to be like, and that I'm going to be busy, and I'm not going to spend as much time on church as I want to, and it's kind of a good week to pull out the greatest hits. And this week, the scripture and life in America and society just said, you ain't doing that this week. Because this week, as I reflected on the word which Martha read for us today, all I could hear was the voices of the traumas of the week that passed. Paul is writing to the church in Rome, in essence to all Romans. In fact, the book of Romans is essentially Paul's systematic theology. Is who a what? That means Paul is laying out what he believes about the nature of Christ for the whole church. And the book of Romans is kind of his final exam paper of theology, of what he believes about God and Christ and the nature of the church, etc. And the first 11 chapters are just that. It is very much a systematic theology. It is what informs, if some of you are familiar with the old teachings and practices of this, the Romans Road, the path to salvation that Paul lays out in Romans. It's what informs his core understanding of God and how that has been transformed through Jesus Christ. And in the midst of this laying out, then chapter 12 comes, and he goes from, this is what I believe, to, so what? And you know it right at the beginning. Because right at the beginning of chapter 12, you may have caught it when it was being read, it said, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters. And we've talked before about when we encounter the word therefore in Scripture, we're supposed to ask ourselves, what? What's it there for? It's right there in the Word. Therefore, what's that there for? So when we encounter the word therefore, we're supposed to ask, what's that there for? And in this case, it is referring back to the idea that I've just laid out what I believe about God, and now I'm going to tell you what to do about it. And in the first 2 verses of the 12th chapter of Romans, Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters. 3 weeks ago I had this fully memorized. Heck, 5 years ago I had it fully memorized. Right now my brain has just stopped. To present yourselves as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, for that is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may know what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I just have to get it going again. That's how that always works. Paul is saying to us that we worship God in spirit and truth by presenting ourselves to God. And then, like the Play-Doh in that tub, or maybe on the carpet, sorry Alice, there's just a little bit, I know where it is, I'll pick it up soon. We knew it was going to happen sooner or later, it's okay, it'll be fine. To be malleable to God's willingness to change us. See, the problem with the exhortation to not be conformed to the world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds, is we don't necessarily have that power in ourselves. We are creatures. We are beings that have instincts and functions and self-protection and protection of those we love and the desire to deal with our fight and flight or flight mentalities. All those things that psychologists have named. We have this instinct that makes it hard to be godlike. Right? It's hard. Anybody tells you it's easy is lying. Anybody tells you Christianity, I am guilty of saying to you all the time, the principles of Christianity are simple, and that's true. The practice of Christianity, however, that's hard. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Paul writes those words to us, and they have even more meaning today. As I dealt with family and friends and generally speaking, but not exclusively, women reliving the trauma of the past in the news cycle of the week, I wept. I shuddered and I shook. As I recognized my own culpability in the system, it became even worse. Some of you know I had a birthday. I just turned 55. I don't mind admitting it. It helps for the story. That makes me 2.5 years older than Brett Kavanaugh. Which means I was a high school kid at the time he was a high school kid. And I remember that culture. I remember that understanding. I read a painfully eye-opening article published in Vox, V-O-X, this week, pointing out how the John Hughes movie 16 Candles starred Molly Ringwald and some of those, most of you are nodding, so you're at least somewhat familiar with 16 Candles. Michael Anthony Hall was in it, a couple others. Was a frightening representation, well, I've got to look around and make sure I'm safe, of the date rape culture of the early 80s. And this article took me down a journey that reminded me that in the early 80s, we thought sexual assault or rape happened in back alleys by strangers in threatening situations. And the notion that it happened from people we knew really didn't exist yet fully, except in the minority voices screaming from the side wings. And when I say minority voices, I mean mainly the women screaming in horror and terror. And as I journeyed through this week, I found myself thinking, what have I done? To whom do I owe an apology? I was a pretty good kid. Don't get me wrong. Don't write a story here that doesn't exist. But I want to take you into my life history for a moment, which perceived in the early 80s that if we're at a party and we appear in a room together, secluded, that implied consent that doesn't exist in our understanding today. You came up the stairs. I thought that meant yes. And that is not right. And our society had to learn it. Was I being conformed to the world? Yeah. Because I know that what is right in the eyes of God and knew what is right in the eyes of God was not consistent with what our culture said. This debate is going to stay long and ugly and horrible. I have told a few of you, and I mean it, I am offended mostly by the political... I'm offended by the event that I suspect probably happened. I'm offended by the public posturing and seeking of power on both sides of the aisle that have used two people's unfortunate life experience to further their own causes. And I am ashamed by that nature of what we've become. But what screams to me from the Scriptures this week is we've got to change our minds. We've got to change our responses to one another. We've got to be willing to say to everyone who cries out, even many years after the fact, I love you, I believe you, I know you have experienced hurt. We've got to be able to say, truth matters. And we've got to be able to say that whether the flag outside our house is mostly red, mostly blue, or some colossally mixed shade of purple in between. Paul tells us, as followers of Christ, to present ourselves before God so that God can change our minds. Not to be conformed to the world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds. For then we know what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And then he goes on to give us the list of how that will manifest in our behavior. Not to be haughty. To treat others with respect. To outdo one another in showing honor. Not to be lacking in zeal for the gospel. To be generous. To be kind, to be loving. That's who we were created to be. That is what glorifies God. I know to an extent, to use an old phrase, I'm preaching to the choir, whether you sang up there a moment ago or not. But change is going to come through each of us being willing to listen, to hear each other's stories, to delicately hear each other's positions, and to seek a truth from God, in whom we trust. It's not going to be easy, but it's got to start somewhere. Why not here? Praise be to God. Amen.